I had always assumed this was nothing more than a heartless transaction where I paid for a child, but had never expected that we were actually gambling our entire futures. She walked away from a full ride to Harvard, turned down a nine-figure marriage settlement, and rejected everything her family had planned just to bet on me and this ridiculous marriage. I used my long-delayed inheritance to bet on her ambition, deluding myself into thinking that a child would at least give me some kind of genetic victory in life. She had no idea that as I sat there with one hand handcuffed to the bedpost, watching her approach through the shadows with a dangerous smile, I was not afraid of dying. My only fear was that she was finally here to settle the score, not for my escape, but for the cowardice and misunderstandings that had always stood between us. That year, she was at the top of the world and seemed to have everything a person could ever want. During that same year, the inheritance I had been waiting on for so long finally hit my bank account. Her name was Olivia Reed. Back in college, she was the president of the student government for our entire department. She was also the only daughter of the wealthiest businessman in Chicago. She was a natural academic, a certified genius with a perfect GPA, and had even secured a full ride to Harvard well in advance. Yet for reasons known only to her, she turned down that dream Ivy League spot. Instead, she chose to attend our decent, but otherwise unremarkable state university. By all accounts, a legendary figure like her should never have crossed paths with an ordinary guy like me. That changed just before graduation when a sudden disaster struck. A massive financial scandal erupted and rocked the entire city, leading to all of her family assets being seized and every single one of their bank accounts being frozen. Overnight, the high and mighty princess was stripped of her status and forced onto the streets. At that exact turning point, an inheritance from a distant relative was quietly deposited into my account. While it was not exactly a massive fortune, it was still more money than I had ever seen in my entire life. I thought about my own family, a long line of blue-collar workers who survived on manual labor. They were all honest, hard-working people, but none of them had ever been given an opportunity like this. A wild and daring thought flashed through my mind, and I realized that this was finally my chance. I drove my beat-up old Prius to the place where she was staying and presented her with an offer she almost could not refuse. I told her I was willing to provide the seed money for her to make a comeback. In exchange, I wanted her to give me a child. I had assumed she would never agree to such a thing. To my surprise, she not only accepted but took that small amount of money and carved out a path to victory against all odds. She climbed back to the top of the social pyramid and rebuilt her family business empire from scratch. To avoid the inevitable day of reckoning, I did the only thing I could think of at the time. I took our daughter, who was only a few months old, and vanished without a trace overnight. That was already 2 years ago. Now, one of my hands is handcuffed to the bedpost as I watch her walk toward me step by step with a slow and steady pace. A cold smile plays on the corners of her lips. My pupils contract instinctively as a wave of panic washes over me. "Do not do anything impulsive," I said with a tight voice. "Murder is still a very serious crime." Her eyes, which were the color of warm whiskey, held a glimmer that had absolutely nothing to do with a desire to kill. "My dear," she whispered softly. Her voice sounded distant, yet carried a dangerous sense of seduction. "It is getting late, and it is time for us to go to sleep. Excuse me, pretty lady, would you like to buy some lemonade? It is extra sweet, I promise." "Oh, you are just too adorable. Can I please pinch your cheeks?" "Hey there, little one. How much for a single cup?" I was reclining in a faded lounge chair with a cigarette dangling from my lips that was nearly burnt down to the filter as I watched my daughter, Hope, standing there. She was balanced on a wobbly little stool, but handled herself perfectly, greeting the college students wandering through the campus plaza with a bright smile. A crowd of people gathered around, completely charmed by her wide eyes and radiant face as they happily reached for their wallets. It was hard to believe that a simple pitcher of powdered lemonade combined with an incredibly sweet child could bring in so much cash. "We have only been out here for an hour, and we are already almost sold out. Daddy, did I do a good job helping you today?" I must have drifted off for a moment, and when I snapped back to reality, Hope had already climbed down from her stool and was curled up on my lap, poking my face with her finger. "You are the absolute best helper in the world," I said as I scooped her up and lifted her high into the air. "My little girl is the greatest," looking at her delicate face, which was as perfect as a porcelain doll. A surge of pride welled up from deep within me until I felt like I might burst. Asking Olivia to have a child for me, despite my lack of shame, was truly the best decision I ever made in my entire life. Hope was essentially a miniature version of her mother, and even her intellect was leagues ahead of any other 2-year-old I had ever seen. She was already capable of doing basic addition and subtraction at her age. To be perfectly honest, it was a little bit intimidating to witness. I just felt incredibly lucky that I managed to secure those elite genes when I had the chance. When I thought back to when I was that age, I was probably still outside somewhere chewing on dirt. Her chubby little finger poked at my chest, and she whispered, "Daddy, look a hole." I looked down to see that a stray spark from my cigarette must have fallen at some point, burning a tiny hole into my t-shirt with a charred brown ring around the edge. I simply laughed it off and pulled her into a tight embrace, burying my face in the softness of her hair. While I was playing around with her, a sharp and angry shout suddenly tore through the air. "Lucas Vance." That voice was as cold as a block of ice and caused my blood to freeze in my veins. Even after all this time, I recognized that voice the very second it hit my ears. I did not dare to turn around and remained frozen in place. But Hope was as fearless as ever and squirmed in my arms to get a better look at the source of the noise. After a second, she let out a small gasp of wonder and said, "Wow, what a pretty lady." I took several deep breaths and repeatedly told myself to stay calm, but my heart was still hammering against my ribs. Finally, I forced myself to turn around and look. She was standing right there, wearing a simple white sundress with only a light touch of makeup on her face and a white silk ribbon tying her dark hair back. She looked almost exactly the same as she did the first time I saw her in our freshman English class all those years ago. I was so stunned that I could not even manage to get a single word out of my mouth. "Excuse me, pretty lady, would you like some lemonade?" Hope asked in her tiny voice, effectively breaking the awkward silence. "We are all sold out for today, so you have to come back much earlier tomorrow." I snapped my gaze back toward Olivia. Her gaze was fixed firmly on me and was as cold as a glacier without a single trace of forgiveness. It was only when she looked down at Hope that a tiny bit of warmth finally flickered in her eyes, looking something like affection. I had always known that she would eventually track me down, but I just never expected it to happen this quickly. As she approached me step by step, my legs began to feel like jelly. The fury in her eyes was unmistakable, and even my own hands began to shake uncontrollably. I had not intentionally gone looking for news about her over the years, but it was impossible to avoid the business headlines. The new CEO of the Reed Group was famous throughout the industry for her decisive and ruthless methods. "Daddy, why are you shaking?" Hope asked as she looked up at me with a face full of pure innocence. I forced a strained smile onto my face and reached up to wipe the sweat from my forehead. "It is nothing, sweetheart. It is just a little bit hot outside today." She mimicked my actions and gently patted my forehead with her tiny hand. I only dared to keep my eyes fixed on the Ice Queen standing before me, forcing my lips into a smile that probably looked worse than crying. Olivia, I still could not help but marvel in my mind at how rapidly she had managed to expand her rebuilt empire. I had hidden myself away in this tiny corner of the state that everyone else had forgotten, yet she still managed to hunt me down in less than 2 years. We just stood there staring at one another without saying a word, and time seemed to stretch out between us like a rubber band. Finally, I watched as her eyes slowly began to brim with tears. I could not handle the heavy silence any longer. "How did you find me?" I asked with a stutter. "Daddy, who is this pretty lady?" Hope chirped in, interrupting our standoff. "I am your mother," Olivia said, and her voice suddenly softened with a warmth I had never heard from her before as she looked at Hope. I had no idea what kind of game she was playing. When Hope was first born, Olivia acted as if even a single glance at the baby was a waste of her time because her mind was entirely occupied by her business plans. I was the one who handled all the late-night feedings and diaper changes entirely on my own. Yet here she was, acting exactly like she was a natural-born mother. Surprisingly, Hope turned to look at me first, her large eyes filled with absolute confusion. Does that mean I get to have a mother too? I completely froze because, to be honest, I never expected her to ask that. She had never mentioned anything about a mother before. Suddenly, the air around us turned cold, and I knew exactly what that meant. I stole a glance at Olivia and saw clearly that the small amount of warmth in her eyes had been covered by frost once again. "Of course you have a mother," I said quickly, trying to smooth over the situation. "How else do you think you got here in the first place?" Hope scratched her little head in thought. Was I not like Superman, falling down to earth from a meteorite? My face suddenly burned bright red with embarrassment. "Who on earth told you that you came from a meteorite?" "You did," she replied with a completely straight face. "Do you not remember telling me that story about a little baby who flew to Earth inside a rocket ship?" Her eyes were shining with excitement, and she looked so confident that I could not even find a way to argue with her. "Lucas Vance," Olivia said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low whisper that felt like a blade. "What exactly have you been teaching our daughter?" "Hey, you cannot blame me for this one," I protested. How was I supposed to know that a 2-year-old would take those stories so seriously? "You see, Olivia, I told you that he was unreliable," another voice chimed in. "He's been filling her head with this nonsense for a long time now." A woman stepped out from behind Olivia, and while she was quite beautiful and almost a match for Olivia, she had a spiteful look in her eyes that she could not hide. "Well, if it isn't Miss Cassie," I said with a sneer. "That explains why I thought I smelled a snake slithering through the grass just now." She was Olivia's cousin, Cassandra Reed. When the Reed family went bankrupt, she was the very first person to disappear, only to come crawling back with a fake smile once Olivia had achieved success again. After Olivia and I got married, Cassie made it her life's mission to target me, never missing an opportunity to put me down while Olivia remained silent. That lack of support was actually one of the reasons I eventually chose to walk away. Cassie immediately looped her arm through Olivia's, putting on an act like she was the one being mistreated. "Look at this, Olivia. We went through all the trouble of traveling all this way to bring him back, and this is how he treats us." Before Olivia could even open her mouth to respond, Hope, who was still resting on my shoulder, spoke up in her sweet little voice. "Auntie, even I do not whine to my daddy like that, and you are grown up, so you should be embarrassed," Hope said. "That is my girl," I said as I burst out laughing so hard I almost lost my breath. "She can tell exactly who is being fake right away." Cassie's face turned bright red instantly, and it was likely the first time in her entire life that she had been called out by a 2-year-old. She yanked her arm away from Olivia and shot me a look filled with pure hatred, but she did not dare to do anything more. Olivia was now the undisputed queen of the Chicago business world, and since Cassie's father relied on expensive contracts with the Reed Group to keep his company afloat, she knew better than to offend the woman who paid her bills. Furthermore, she was well aware that the little girl standing in front of her was the most precious thing in the world to Olivia. "That is enough," Olivia said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. My laughter stopped immediately, and my expression turned cold as I waited for her to take Cassie's side, just like she always used to do. To my complete surprise, she turned and pointed directly at her cousin instead. "You're going back to the office right this second." Cassie was stunned, her lips trembling as she tried to form a response, but she could not manage to get a single word out. Olivia did not even give her a second glance, simply waving her hand to signal for her to get out of there. Then she reached out her arms with a clear intention. She wanted to hold Hope. Cassie lowered her head and walked away with slumped shoulders, but after a few steps, she could not resist looking back at Olivia, and for a fleeting moment, her expression was incredibly venomous. She thought nobody was watching, but I saw the greed and malice in her eyes perfectly clearly. At the same time, Hope was looking up at me with a whirlwind of emotions in her eyes, including fear, longing, anticipation, and nervousness all mixed together. I had absolutely no desire to let Olivia hold her, But then I saw a raw sense of vulnerability on her face for the very first time. I suddenly remembered how she looked lying in that hospital bed after giving birth, looking so weak and completely alone. I gave Hope a very slight nod, one that was almost imperceptible to anyone else. My daughter nervously reached out her hands with her tiny face tensed up as she looked at Olivia. Seeing her look so anxious made my heart feel like it was being sliced by a blade. Olivia pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her so closely that she finally reached her breaking point and collapsed emotionally. "My beautiful baby girl," she sobbed out, unable to even finish a full sentence through her tears. This was the very first time I had ever seen this woman cry. She had not shed a single tear when her family went bankrupt or when she was so poor she could barely afford to eat, yet now she was completely falling apart. Even though this was the first time she had ever truly held our daughter, and despite her messy sobbing, I had to admit that the image of them together was beautiful. "Are you really my mommy?" Hope whispered as she gripped Olivia tightly and began to cry herself. Sometimes the bond of blood is so powerful that it is actually frightening. Even though she had never met this woman before, she seemed to know exactly who she was on a deep and primal level. Seeing the two of them about to dissolve into a puddle of tears, I decided to try and be the good guy for once. "All right, that is enough. Do not go keeping her all to yourself now," I said. "Shut up," they both replied at the exact same time, snapping their heads around to glare at me. I immediately put my hands up in surrender. "Okay, fine, you two are the bosses and everything I say is wrong." To be honest, I truly did miss her, but the gap between us had grown from a simple crack into a massive canyon. Watching them huddled together like a real family for the first time caused a genuine smile to spread across my face. They sat there lost in their own little world, so I took the opportunity to quietly step away and buy a couple of bottles of water. I was not at all worried that she might try to run off with Hope right then. I knew enough about her character to trust her that much, and besides, there was no way Hope would abandon the father who had raised her for the past 2 years for a mother she had only just met. Sure enough, when I returned with the water, they were sitting side by side on a bench holding hands and chatting like they had been friends for years. There she was, the girl I had once loved with all my heart, sitting with the child she had given me who looked exactly like her. For a brief moment, I genuinely wished that time would just stop right there. However, reality always has a way of showing up uninvited to ruin the moment. As I approached, Olivia stood up and tightened her grip on Hope's small hand, her face showing a rare look of hesitation. "Lucas, I was thinking," she began, but I cut her off immediately. "Do not even think about it." I could allow them to have this brief moment together, but that did not mean I was going to let her just walk away with my daughter. I was far too familiar with that look on her face and knew exactly what she was about to say. Right at that moment, my parents walked over to us. They still ran a small vegetable stall at the local farmer's market because even with the inheritance, they could not stand being idle. That is just how people who have worked their whole lives are. The moment they saw Olivia, they froze in their tracks, their shock quickly turning into awkwardness. "Olivia, dear, you are here," my mother said, her voice sounding a bit dry. After all, they had been my co-conspirators in the Great Escape Plan 2 years ago. Seeing their former daughter-in-law again suddenly made the atmosphere incredibly tense. Olivia simply gave them a polite nod in return. "Mom, Dad," I said as a reminder, not bothering to play nice. She was allowed to hold Hope and talk to her today, but the next step of taking her away was absolutely out of the question. I reached out and scooped Hope back into my arms, feeling the clear resistance in her tiny body as she looked longingly at Olivia. I pointedly avoided looking in Olivia's direction because I was terrified that a single glance would make my heart soften completely. My parents saw me acting like I was preparing for a major battle. They immediately understood the situation and stepped forward to flank me like a pair of temporary bodyguards, keeping a wary eye on Olivia. Seeing the defensive line we had formed, Olivia realized that she was not going to win this fight today. She let out a soft sigh. "I have to get back to the office," she said, though the excuse came so quickly it felt a bit forced. She turned around to leave. I watched her walk away and hesitated for a few seconds, but since she was Hope's mother, I decided to give her a warning. Hey! She stopped in her tracks, but did not turn around, likely because she was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to stop herself from trying to take Hope back. Watch out for Cassie, I called out. The way she looked at you when she left earlier was not right. I noticed her shoulders relax slightly, and I could imagine a small, smug smile forming on her face. She was probably thinking that I was an idiot who still cared about her. She just raised her hand and gave a casual wave over her shoulder without looking back before getting into her car and driving away. Hope's eyes immediately filled with tears as she stared at the car's taillights until they completely vanished from view. Daddy, she whispered, will I ever get to see my mommy again? My parents and I exchanged a helpless look. Yes, you will, baby, I replied, though the lie tasted as bitter as ash in my mouth. We did not say another word after that as we packed up the little lemonade stand and rushed back home. Once we were in the living room, Hope was still buzzing with excitement, already planning out what outfit she wanted to wear the next time she saw her mother. Meanwhile, the three of us adults remained in a terrifying silence. We have to move again, I finally said. My parents looked at each other and then both nodded in agreement. My father pulled Hope onto his lap and held her tightly. When I first told my father that I had a daughter, he was actually quite disappointed because he had always talked about wanting a grandson. Now, however, he would not trade her for 10 grandsons combined. They understood exactly what had happened today and what was at stake. They knew that with the power the Reed family now possessed, it would be incredibly easy for them to take Hope away from us. Olivia only had to say the word and half of Chicago would be lining up to do her bidding. They will have to go through me first, my mother said through gritted teeth as she stroked Hope's hair. Nobody is touching my granddaughter. I frowned and took a long drag of my cigarette. We cannot wait around, I said. We pack tonight and we leave immediately. We would abandon the vegetable stall and the lemonade stand, focusing only on packing up the valuables we could actually carry. My parents had hardly touched the inheritance money, preferring to live off the modest income from their stall. This meant that we were financially able to disappear all over again if we had to. Soon, the house was filled with the sounds of drawers being emptied and closets being cleared out. A short while later, we were sitting in the living room surrounded by stuffed suitcases and the mess left behind by our frantic packing. Hope had no idea what was actually going, but was still jumping around with excitement about seeing her mother again. Daddy, are we moving to a new house? She asked as the sky outside began to grow dark. That is right, I said, trying my best to sound cheerful. We are moving to a much bigger house so that your mommy can come over and play with you all the time. As I watched her spin around in circles with joy, a wave of guilt washed over me. I nearly blurted out the truth, but managed to swallow the words at the last second. If she knew that we were actually running away to hide from her mother, she would never agree to leave. Late that night, I picked up a yawning and exhausted Hope in one arm while grabbing her small suitcase with the other. My parents followed closely behind me, carrying the rest of the luggage. The moment I pulled open the front door, I froze instantly. Standing right there on the porch under the dim yellow light was Olivia. Her face was perfectly calm, but she radiated a coldness that made it impossible to read her emotions. What a coincidence, she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. Where are you headed with all of these bags, sweetheart? My brain felt like it had short-circuited. I could not imagine a more embarrassing situation than being caught red-handed by my wife while trying to run away with our child. It really is a coincidence, seeing you here, I said with a dry, hollow laugh. Behind me, my parents were also frozen in place, and their suitcases slipped from their hands and hit the floor with a heavy thud. We all stood there in a tense standoff without anyone saying a word. My mother was the first one to break the silence, speaking up despite her obvious discomfort. Olivia, dear, we were just about to go and look for you because we were just saying how a child really needs to be with her mother. Exactly, my father added quickly. At Hope's age, having a mother around is the most important thing. I was absolutely stunned by their sudden change of heart. What happened to the plan we had discussed earlier, the one involving people going over my mother's dead body? But when I looked at Olivia and saw the layer of ice in her eyes under the moonlight, I decided to grit my teeth and go along with my mother's ridiculous excuse. "I'm very happy to hear you say that," Olivia replied casually, "because I am actually here to take you all home." She raised her hand and gave 2 soft claps. Immediately, a line of men in black suits emerged from the shadows of the streetlights and efficiently took the luggage from our hands, loading it into a fleet of black sedans parked nearby. My parents and I exchanged a look that said we had been completely defeated. She had even brought bodyguards with her, proving that this was not a discussion at all, but a forced relocation. A string snapped inside of me because I absolutely hated being controlled like this. The thing I could not stand most was how she always made decisions for everyone without ever asking for my input. It was just like when she hired Cassie at the company without saying a word to me. And when I finally found the courage to tell her what kind of person Cassie really was, she acted like she hadn't even heard me. "What is your plan? Are you just going to drag her back to that mansion of yours?" I asked with a voice full of sarcasm. "Are you going to dump her with a nanny so you can travel the world again, just like you did when she was first born?" A flash of guilt crossed her face, but it was quickly replaced by a mysterious smile. When did I ever say that I was planning to take her away? That single sentence left me completely stunned, and all of my anger deflated like a popped balloon. "You are not taking her?" I asked. She looked at me as if I were an idiot. "I am her mother, Lucas. So do I not have the right to see my own child whenever I want to? If I was truly planning to take her by force, do you really think I would have come here personally?" she asked. "Oh," I replied, and even to my own ears, that one word sounded incredibly stupid. It turned out that my entire late-night escape plan had been completely unnecessary. "Of course, you definitely have that right," I stammered as my face began to burn with embarrassment. As long as she wasn't planning on taking my daughter away permanently, I was open to negotiating everything else. My parents watched as their son was played like a fool, and they both let out a heavy sigh while shaking their heads in disappointment. Without saying a single word to me, they walked right past and got into the Rolls-Royce parked behind Olivia's car, giving me a look that said I was beyond help before closing the door. I had absolutely no idea what I had done to annoy them this time. Olivia looked at my confused expression and let out a soft sigh, shaking her head in a weary manner. She very carefully took the sleeping Hope from my arms and turned to walk toward the car. I stood there on the curb for a long time with my mind in a complete muddle. It turned out that all she wanted this whole time was to see her daughter, and she hadn't even mentioned me at all. For some reason, I felt a strange emptiness in my chest, as if a piece of me had been carved out. The car window slowly rolled down, and Olivia poked her head out. "What are you still doing standing there? Get in the car and drive." I snapped out of my daze and met her eyes, which were filled with complex emotions. "I am coming," I muttered. On the drive back to Chicago, Hope woke up in Olivia's arms and began happily chirping "Mommy, Mommy" over and over again. She looked completely content and did not even bother to ask where her daddy was. I felt a slight sinking sensation in my heart. Could the bond of blood really be that powerful? Had I become invisible to her after she spent less than a day with her mother? I caught a glimpse of them in the rearview mirror and saw the two of them having the time of their lives together. "That is just great, Hope," I said with a voice dripping with bitterness. "Now that you have a new mommy, you have completely forgotten about your poor old dad." Her response was like a knife to my heart when she asked, "Daddy, what are you even doing here?" I nearly slammed my head against the steering wheel. What am I doing here? Am I supposed to be riding in the trunk instead? Seeing my dejected face, she quickly leaned forward and gave me a big, wet kiss on the cheek. My mood instantly lifted quite a bit after that. But that feeling only lasted for a moment before she turned back to her mother and went right back to giggling. The laughter from the back seat was getting louder and louder, making me start to regret agreeing to this so quickly. If things kept going like this, I wouldn't have to worry about Olivia kidnapping her, because Hope would probably pack her own bags and move in with her mother voluntarily. Eventually, the car pulled up in front of a very modern and stylish villa. This was the house that I had personally bought back then. I had purchased that villa with a large portion of my inheritance shortly after Hope was born. As it turned out, we only actually lived there for a few months before I took her and fled. After getting out of the car, Hope was practically hanging off Olivia and would not stop calling her mommy. I just rolled my eyes and followed them inside, entertaining myself by making faces at their backs while they weren't looking. They were so lost in the joy of their reunion that they did not even notice me standing there like a piece of furniture. As for my parents, they had been dropped off halfway through the trip because they said they wanted to go visit some old friends. I collapsed onto the soft sofa and sprawled out. Even though I had only been driving for a few hours today, I felt incredibly exhausted, probably because I had been so lazy lately. These days, the most strenuous thing I did was pressing the start button on a blender. When you think about it, we hadn't actually run very far at all. I had figured that the safest place to hide was right under her nose, which is why I chose to settle in a small town just outside the Chicago city limits. If I had tried to hide in a major city, someone with the resources would have found us within a few weeks. Once Hope had played herself out and fallen asleep in her mother's arms, Olivia carefully carried her into the master bedroom. When she came back out and saw me sprawled out across the sofa, she noticeably frowned at me. I heard her footsteps approaching, but only bothered to lazily open one eye. She stood over me looking down, and I did not even have the energy to sit up. "What is it?" I asked in a mumble. She sat down in the armchair across from me. "What are your plans for the future?" I didn't even look at her as I muttered my two-word response, "Retire wealthy." Her lip twitched slightly as she struggled to find a response to my blatant lack of ambition. A long silence followed before I slowly opened my eyes again. Seeing the look of inner conflict on her face, I decided to just close my eyes again. "If you have something to say, just say it." Olivia took a deep breath and focused her gaze on a spot on the wall. "I'm currently in need of a new executive assistant, and I was thinking that you could come and work for me." "A job?" I replied without a moment's hesitation as I turned her down. "Maybe in the next life." Honestly, I had plenty of inheritance money to live on, so why on earth would I want to start working? Besides, that job sounded like I would have one foot in her private life and the other acting like some kind of high-class servant. Even if a small part of me wanted to spend more time with her again, I was certain there were ways to do that were 10,000 times easier than becoming her subordinate. "What kind of example do you think you are setting for your daughter?" she asked with a cold voice. That question actually managed to make me sit up a little straighter. I looked her straight in the eye and said every word clearly. She could just enjoy being rich and lazy right alongside her father. Just as I expected, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly. Olivia, who had been relatively calm just a moment ago, suddenly looked like her face was made of ice and a dangerous glint appeared in her eyes. I immediately put my hands up in surrender. "I'm just kidding. It was just a joke. With a role model like you in the house, her path in life is already decided. I will just be the relaxed parent who helps take the pressure off her studies. You know what I mean?" The coldness in the air slowly began to fade away, and I let out a quiet sigh of relief. "I'm not going to bother arguing with you anymore," she said as she stood up and walked toward the door. "Work for me if you want to, or don't. It is up to you." As she reached the door, she added one more thing. "I have to get back to the office." I could have sworn I heard a faint trace of disappointment in her voice. However, she was true to her word and did not try to take Hope away with her. I knew that she owned several different properties and usually rotated between them. The moment I heard her car engine roar to life in the driveway, I jumped up from the sofa and quietly made my way toward the bedroom. I stood at the door for a full minute, taking deep breaths and giving myself a pep talk. I told myself that I was just going in to check on Hope and was not there to snoop through her private things. I just wanted to see my child, and that was it. Then I opened the door. My eyes immediately began scanning every corner of the room. The decor was almost exactly the same as when I had left, with almost nothing changed at all. I looked the entire room over from top to bottom to make sure there were no signs of another man being there, and only after confirming that did I truly feel relieved. I finally turned my attention back to the little one sleeping soundly on the bed. I leaned down and gave her a gentle kiss on the cheek before quietly sneaking back out of the room. I had just closed the door when Cassie Reed burst into the house like a whirlwind, shouting at the top of her lungs for Olivia. Thinking about my daughter who had just fallen asleep, my last bit of patience vanished instantly. I grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back out the front door. "What the hell do you think you were doing? Get your hands off of me, you hillbilly," she said as she struggled to pull her arm away. "Olivia went back to the office," I said in a cold voice, completely ignoring her insults. "Well, look who we have here," she sneered. "I see the runaway husband couldn't help but come crawling back after all. You just couldn't stay away from my cousin's money, could you?" I gave her a wide smile that was filled with pure malice. "That is right. I am back to enjoy the good life, which is still a lot better than some people who are willing to sell their souls just to get a promotion." Cassie froze for a moment, and her face twisted in shock. "How could you possibly know about?" she started, but I leaned in close and lowered my voice as if I were telling her a deep secret. "Are you talking about that little incident in Miami with a cryptocurrency mogul? Do you really need me to go into more detail about that?" "Cassandra, oh Cassandra," I said, drawing out her name. "It is such a beautiful name, but it is a shame it belongs to someone with such a dirty and fake personality." I knew a lot more than she thought I did. Her fingers were shaking violently as she pointed at me and stammered that I was lying. But before she could finish her sentence, she practically fled from the yard in terror. I watched her scurrying away, and a smile curled onto my lips. "You're just a child if you think you can play games with me. You aren't even in the same league." "Is that so? It sounds like you are quite well informed." I spun around instantly to find Olivia standing right behind me. I jumped in surprise and felt my heart tighten with anxiety. "What are you doing back here already?" My panicked reaction clearly killed off whatever curiosity she had, and that familiar coldness returned to her expression. "What? Am I no longer allowed to come back to my own home?" "That is not what I meant at all," I explained quickly. "It is just that you said you were heading to the office, so seeing you back so soon was a bit of a surprise." She just gave me a look that said I was a headache before walking past me toward her car without saying another word. That was when I noticed the folder she was holding in her hand. I smacked my forehead as I realized she had just come back for some documents she had forgotten. My brain was clearly not working right. As her car drove past me, she rolled down the window with an expression as serious as if she were in a board meeting. "Since you have so much free time at home, you should try reading a book," she said. "There's an author named Julian Croft that you should go look up." With that, she hit the gas and disappeared down the street. "An author named Julian Croft? Give me a break. I might not be a genius, but I did graduate with a degree in literature." What exactly did she think of me? Someone who had never even opened a book before. Still, for some reason, I found myself pulling out my phone to search for him anyway. His author page popped up immediately, and his most famous work was titled The Idiot. I understood then. It was just like when a kid gives you a book and tells you to turn to a certain page, only for you to find a note saying that you are a fool. I actually laughed out loud at that. She certainly had a lot of nerve. I muttered under my breath about her being bold while I walked back into the empty villa. The oversized living room suddenly felt very awkward and was not welcoming at all. I sank into the sofa as a strange sense of irritation began to creep into my mind. I started to wonder if deciding to come back here had actually been a massive mistake. The next month flew by in the blink of an eye. Olivia had kept her word and came by often to see Hope without ever mentioning taking her away. She even ended up staying over at the villa for about 20 nights, though we always slept in separate bedrooms. Watching her and Hope chase each other around the house and laugh together every day left me with a strange feeling of loss. It felt as though I had become nothing more than a spectator in my own life. My parents only lasted a few days in the city before the fast-paced lifestyle became too much for them, and they rushed back to their quiet little town. One afternoon, I left Hope with a nanny and went out for a stroll. The streets were bustling with people, but as I walked among them, I felt like a message in a bottle floating aimlessly with no idea where I was going. By the time I snapped out of it, I was standing in front of a familiar barbecue joint. This was the place where my best friend Mark and I used to spend countless nights drinking beer and talking about life. I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. "Hey, I am at the usual barbecue spot." "Lucas? Is that really you?" he shouted on the other end. "You finally decided to give me a call. Stop talking and just order plenty of food. Are you coming or what? I'm definitely going to be there, and I'm going to drink you under the table tonight." I hung up the phone and went inside to order a massive spread of food and a whole case of beer. By the time he strolled into the place, the table was filled with sizzling food that smelled absolutely amazing. We talked and drank as time slipped away unnoticed until the floor around our table was covered in empty beer bottles. Both of our faces were bright red from the alcohol, and our voices had grown loud and booming. "Life is so incredibly hard, man," I said as the alcohol loosened my tongue and the words started pouring out. "I'm living under the same roof as my wife again, but I feel like I am just a ghost haunting the place. Every time I step into that house, all I can think about is those first few months after Hope was born when Olivia wouldn't even look at her." I poured out all the frustration and resentment I had been bottling up for the last 2 years along with the beer, and it felt surprisingly good to finally say it out loud. "You have absolutely no idea how lucky you really are," Mark mumbled incoherently since he was also completely trashed. "After you ran off with Hope, Olivia completely lost it, and I have never seen anyone look so broken in my entire life." "You're talking nonsense," I said as I poured myself another glass of beer. "She only married me because she wanted that inheritance money." "Are you out of your mind?" Mark asked, his eyes suddenly widening as if the shock had sobered him up for a split second. That son of a tech billionaire from Atherton offered her a 9-figure marriage settlement to marry him back then, and she turned him down flat. She chose to take your meager inheritance instead of that massive fortune. "Is that really true?" I mumbled as my tongue felt like it was tied in knots. My head slumped onto the table, and everything went black as I completely passed out. What I did not know was that the moment I lost consciousness, the drunken fog in Mark's eyes vanished instantly. He gave my shoulder a shake, and when he saw that I was completely unresponsive, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. "He is down for the count," he said into the phone. A short while later, Olivia pushed open the door and walked into the barbecue joint. She gave Mark a nod of thanks and efficiently hoisted my arm over her shoulder, dragging my unconscious body out of the restaurant. Mark watched us leave and casually picked up an unfinished bottle of beer from the table. He took a long swig of beer and let out a deep sigh, wondering to himself when he would finally have a real relationship of his own instead of always playing a supporting role in their carefully orchestrated love story. As it turned out, Olivia had already noticed that I was not acting like myself and had someone following me that day. The moment I called Mark, he immediately relayed the message to her, and the two of them teamed up to set a trap so they could get me to open up. When I finally woke up, Olivia was sitting right there on the edge of the bed. I thought I was still dreaming because the Ice Queen was actually smiling at me. Purely out of instinct, I reached out and pinched her cheek to see if she was real. The softness was unmistakably real, which caused my blurry eyes to snap wide open. I quickly looked down to check myself, and was relieved to find that all of my clothes were still perfectly in place. "What is it?" she asked with a teasing smile as she watched me frantically checking my clothes. "Were you afraid that I might have taken advantage of you?" "Not at all," I replied with a mischievous grin. I was actually worried that if something did happen while I was asleep, I would have been really disappointed to miss out on it. A faint blush spread across her face, and she muttered that I was a pervert, but her smile only grew wider. Then, she produced a bowl of chicken soup from behind her back and handed it to me. I saw the thick chunks of chicken at the bottom of the bowl and could not help but smile. "Did you actually cook this for me?" I asked. "No, the nanny made it," she replied as she looked away with a cute, stubborn expression. I made up my mind to tease her a bit and gave her a look that said I knew exactly what was going on. "Is that so?" "Because I do not believe that for a single second." Her face turned bright red, and she bit her lower lip in frustration. "Fine then, drink it or don't. I am taking it back," she huffed as she made a move to stand up. I quickly snatched the bowl from her hands. "I am drinking it, of course I am. I wouldn't dare refuse anything you give me." I took a spoonful and found that it was actually rich and delicious. However, I purposely scrunched up my face in a look of disgust and pointed at the bowl to complain. "Ugh, this is so salty and it tastes so bitter." She immediately grabbed the bowl back from me. "That is impossible. I've barely put any salt in there at all," she said before taking a sip herself to check the taste. I just sat there watching her, my heart filled with a sense of pure happiness. Yet even in a moment like this, the memories of those first few months after Hope was born still felt like a thorn buried in my heart. After realizing she had been tricked, Olivia's face turned even redder, and she shot me a glare filled with faux anger that actually looked more like flirting. She turned around to leave the room, but when she reached the door, she suddenly stopped and looked back at me with a calm expression. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "Tomorrow, you will finally understand everything." That sentence left me completely baffled. Understand what exactly? She refused to say another word of explanation. No matter how much I racked my brain, I could not figure out what she was talking about, so all I could do was wait. The very next day, the news spread like wildfire through the city. Olivia Reed had done something that absolutely nobody expected. She had personally seen to it that her own uncle and his entire family were sent to prison. The storm had originally started with Cassie after someone reported her for embezzling company funds, and the subsequent investigation led to the discovery of her father's long history of massive tax evasion and fraudulence. All of their dirty secrets were dragged into the light. From that day forward, the name Olivia Reed became a legend within the social circles and boardrooms of Chicago. She had become a living warning that nobody dared to cross. If she was willing to ruthlessly drag her own relatives into court, there was no telling what she was capable of doing to her actual enemies. I sat there on the sofa, staring blankly at the screen of my phone. In the video, Olivia stood at the podium of the press conference and calmly listed every single one of the crimes committed by her uncle and cousin. I was completely mesmerized watching her command the room with such strength and composure. Suddenly, a pair of soft arms wrapped around my neck from behind, and her familiar scent enveloped me. "My dear," she whispered into my ear with a voice full of suppressed emotion. "Do you have any idea how much I wanted to hold Hope when she was first born?" Her voice was trembling slightly as she spoke, but I did not dare to do it. My uncle and his family were watching my every move back then. If I had shown even a single moment of weakness, they would have used Hope to control me. I had known for a long time that they were the ones who destroyed my father. I had to get revenge, which meant I had to stay cold and build up my armor piece by piece. But by the time I was finally strong enough to face them head on, you had already left. My unreliable husband had taken our daughter and vanished overnight. It is lucky for us that you did not run too far away. If you had truly hidden yourself at the ends of the earth, I might never have been able to find you. I felt my shoulder slowly becoming damp and confused. In that moment, everything finally clicked into place. Her coldness, her distance, and her obsessive work habits had all been an act she forced herself to perform. The thorn that had been buried in my heart for 2 years was finally pulled out. I gently turned around and pulled the trembling, sobbing woman into my arms, holding her tightly as I leaned down to kiss away the tears from her eyes. Once she had calmed down a bit, the conversation I had with Mark at the barbecue joint suddenly came back to me. I could not resist the urge to tease her, and a mischievous smile slowly spread across my face. "Mark told me that you turned down a 9-figure offer from some billionaire son, just so you could take my modest little inheritance instead. Does that mean that my beautiful wife has actually had a secret crush on me for a very long time?" Her face turned red all the way to her ears, and she buried her face in my chest, refusing to look up at me. "You said I liked you. You were such a narcissist," she retorted. "Oh, is that so?" I said with a low laugh. "You're still being so stubborn, so I guess I'll just have to verify it for myself." With that, I silenced all of her protests with a kiss. It felt like a torrential downpour, finally hitting a desert that had been parched for years. The storm of passion that followed was inevitable, lasting all the way until dawn with no intention of slowing down. This gripping narrative follows Lucas, an ordinary man who uses a surprise inheritance to fund the comeback of Genevieve Reed, a fallen socialite and genius, in exchange for a child. However, fearing her perceived coldness and ruthless ambition, Lucas flees with their infant daughter, Hope, and stays hidden for 2 years. Upon being tracked down, the icy facade of the Ice Queen shatters to reveal a heartbreaking truth. Genevieve's initial indifference was a calculated sacrifice to shield her family from predatory relatives while she dismantled their enemies. unspoken devotion that survived years of misunderstanding.